What a blessing to be with you this evening. And hope you all are staying halfway cool. Been talking in Matthew. There's 5 discourses in Matthew, 5 Jesus discourses in Matthew. And we've been kind of looking at some of those. And this evening we're going to look at the third one of those, and that's called the parable discourse. And some people call it the kingdom parables. It's in Matthew 13. We looked at the Sermon on the Mount. We looked at the mission discourse, Matthew 10. That was a last Sunday evening, and now we're looking at this parabolic discourse. It's divided into 7 parables. The parabolic discourse consists of 7 parables, 4 outside and 3 inside the house. Outside the house is a parable of the sower, the tares, the mustard, and the leaven. And inside the house is a parable of the hidden treasure, the pearl, and drawing the net. You know, as I thought about these parables, these kingdom parables, these are parables about the kingdom of heaven, what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. What are we going to compare it to? What's it going to, how are we going to see it? What are we going to know it? And as we really think about that, it's really funny how all these parables kind of throw things in the face of a lot of what people believe about the end of the world. A lot of people think, well, it's going to be like this rapture, and people are going to be raptured, and then there's going to be this kind of earthly kingdom, and then there's going to be this other rapture, right? And there's going to be this end time. But really, if you really look at these parables, a lot of that kind of throws in the face of that. Because Jesus, in a lot of these, he talks not only about the value of the kingdom, he talks about the end of the kingdom. And so it's kind of interesting, and I think as you look at this, there's a shift in the middle of this, and I'm not going to read all this word for word. The first parable is the parable of the sower, and that's something that one of those parables that Jesus says the parable, then he explains the parable. He doesn't always do that. There's 2 times that happens in this discourse. The second time we'll talk about in a minute. But this is one of those times when he actually tells a story, and then he explains what the story means. We've all heard this parable a lot of times. And there's something you might have heard sermons on. And we think, well, what is it? And we all kind of got an idea of what this means. But what this parable has always said to me is that we're just seed spreaders, I'm not supposed to be judging who I talk to or who I share God's word with or whether or not I think they need it or whether or not they'll respond to it. My job is just to share it. And I think that's really what this parable is about. We're all spreading this seed. If you've ever just broadcast seed where you just spread it or spread it in a deal on you crank or just throw it and broadcast seed, this makes sense to you. Some of it lasts, some of it doesn't. Some of it the birds eat, some of it comes up and dies. Some of it, hopefully, it grows. And that's really what Jesus is saying here. But every time I read this, that's what I always come away with this. Every time I ever look at this parable, I always come away with that. I'm not to be judging where the seed falls. It kind of looks like if you were a farmer and you was putting down seed, I've done that a few times. You get the ground ready, you prepare it, you fertilize it, because you want all that seed to grow, don't you? You want all that seed to grow up. You want all that seed to be productive. But in this case, it's God who really tills the field, who gets things ready. Our job is just to spread it, and hopefully some of what we spread, it comes up and brings a crop. So Jesus starts this discourse with this kind of lengthy parable about the sower. But then he talks about the tares. And I think this is one of those sermons, one of those parables, when Jesus moves into this. He's still working on the seed thing, still working on the farm thing, still working along that way. But he says it's another parable, right? It's compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat. It went away. But when the wheat was sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. And the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, "Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? And how does it have tares?" And he said to them, "An enemy has done this." The slave said to him, "Do you want us then to go and gather them up?" But he said, "No. For while you're gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat. Allow them both to grow together until the harvest. At the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles and burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. I think it's one of those parables about the end of the kingdom, isn't it? He talked in the beginning about the beginning of the kingdom, sowing the seed. Sprouts up, doesn't sprout up, whatever. But then he talks immediately, he goes into the end of the kingdom. What's the end of it going to be like? So you've sowed your seed and your crops came up, but now you've got these tares. Of course, in the explanation of this, he says Satan's the one that comes in, right? Sows the tares. But I think the interesting thing about this parable to me is that it kind of throws it in the face of this idea that there's going to be like multiple resurrections, multiple judgments, raptures, all that stuff. Because basically he's saying, listen, it's all going to be gathered at the same time. There's not going to be two separate harvests. You're not going to go get the tares. You know, well, that might kind of make sense. You pull those tares up, but then he says, oh, but you might get some wheat. And when I think of that, I always think, you know, if he was to go into the world and gather up all the, I guess you'd say the tares or the weeds, maybe some of those might, in God's eyes and God's way, might turn into wheat, right? I mean, they might turn out to be good. You know, and of course in this case, you don't see that, but I always think that. But I think it really kind of gives the idea, it's kind of interesting to me. He starts at the beginning, sowing the seed, and then he goes to the end. This is what's going to be in the end. And in the end, we're going to gather all that up. But then he says, but then we're going to divide it. It's kind of like that sheep and goat judgment, right? Going to put the sheep on the left, goats on the right. He's going to put, or goats on the left, anyway. But we're kind of like that sheep-goat judgment. We're going to divide it up. We're going to put the good on one side, the bad on the other side. And then he says, and I think it's interesting, we're going to burn them up, right? A lot of people look at passages like this, and there's several of them, especially in the Gospels, where it talks about burning them up or destroying them with fire. And so a lot of people have taken that to mean that hell's not eternal. In other words, they're just not going to cease to exist. And I think that's a whole other discussion, and there's indication that judgment, punishment is eternal. But a lot of people take it to mean that eventually, in the end, what's wicked will simply cease to exist. Kind of an interesting kind of theology that you kind of run into these days. It seems like more and more. But then in the third one, he gets into the mustard seed. So he talked about the beginning of the kingdom. He talked about the end of the kingdom. And now he's going to talk about the middle of the kingdom. Kind of interesting, right? He does the beginning, he does the end, now he's going to do the middle. Parable of the mustard seed. You know, when I saw this parable as a kid, I thought, how small is a mustard seed? I don't know. That's what you think. So you Google it, because Google knows everything, right? And you see how small a mustard seed is. Mustard seed's a little bitty thing, but it grows into a great big plant. But that's not the point. The point what Jesus is saying is that even though it starts so small, it's going to grow into something so big. You know, that parable, literally, historically, we see that, don't we? We see this parable. The kingdom of God started in a nondescript part of the world by nondescript people. And yet look how big it is today, right? It's huge. It's all over the world. So what Jesus said, he was right. It starts out so small, but it's going to be so big. And that's true. But then, before Jesus goes inside, he talks about this idea of leaven. He says he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. I think we see this parable, and it's kind of short, this particular one. And we think, well, you know, we're talking about leaven, and I've heard a lot of sermons about that. Leaven, a little bit of leaven, and we all know that. I think we do. A little bit of yeast will leaven a whole bunch of dough. My grandmother, she made rolls my entire life, and you know, she basically used that same bit of yeast over and over. She'd take a little starter, she'd start the next batch. So we kind of understand that, kind of maybe that idea of it. But I think the other thing that we see is that it was hid. The part I think we miss in this is it was hid in 3 pecks of flour. Now that's a lot of flour, but Jesus said it was hid in there. The kingdom of heaven was hid in 3 pecks of flour. And you kind of think, what does that mean? What's he talking about? Well, I think what it means is that in the middle of this Judaism, in the middle of all this Jewish idea, the kingdom of heaven was hid in the middle of it. But it's going to leaven the whole lump. It's going to grow into the whole lump. So it kind of goes along with that idea, but then it kind of changes. But after this parable, Jesus goes in the house. So he just takes those people in with him. And when he goes in the house, he's going to explain the parable of the tares. He goes in the house, he explains the parable of the tares, right? So when he goes inside, he says, this is the parable of the tares. He said, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. The tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned, so shall it be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels. They will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire. In the place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of the Father. He who has ears, let him hear. So Jesus takes these people, these apostles, in, and he goes, and I don't know why he shifted venues. It's kind of interesting because Jesus often taught in parables. He said, I don't want everybody to understand it. So maybe that was why. He didn't want to explain to everybody what the parable of the tares was. So he took those closest to him in the house, and he said, now I'm going to tell you what the parable of the tares are, now that I've got you here by myself. But then Jesus went on to give them 3 more parables. You know, Matthew, the reason we're looking at Matthew is because Matthew has so many letters in red. So much Jesus stuff, direct quotes of Christ. Not stuff that's like handed down or second, but direct quotes, what we call letters in red, right? If you got a red letter Bible, you'll see that if you look through Matthew. Tremendous volume of Matthew is red lettered. And so he goes in, he does this explanation, but then he's going to go into 3 more parables that he's going to share with just those people he takes into the house. And one of them is this parable of the hidden treasure. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again, and from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. I always thought that was one of the most interesting parables that Jesus ever said, because it almost seems a little deceptive, doesn't it? You know? So he finds this treasure in this field, and he buries it and goes and buys the field, you know, instead of just stealing the treasure or telling the guy that actually owns the field, you got treasure in your field. Anyway, it always kind of bothered me a little bit, right? But so he does that, and he sells all that he has, it says. But I think what Jesus was saying here was not just so much about the value, because we're going to get into that value, because he's going to do the pearl. So we're going to get into the value of the kingdom. So I don't think this parable was necessarily about the value of it. This parable was more about the idea that it was hidden in this Judaism, hidden where it was, but that it was worth everything that guy had to go and do it, and to get it from that field. You know, he didn't take it out. There's a message in this parable. He did it there. So if you kind of look at the idea that maybe that field is Judaism, maybe he's doing it there and buying that field, because that's the field that's important to Jesus. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can look at it. Parables are such great stories because we can look at them from a lot of different angles, and they give us a lot of different perspectives about what Jesus was trying to say, what Jesus was trying to tell us. But if you go to what he says on the next, he says, is a parable of the pearl of great price, right? So he talks about this treasure. This treasure is worth everything the man has, but he goes and he buries it back in the field, and then he goes and buys the field, and then he gets the treasure. So I think maybe there's more to that parable, like I say, than just value. But when we get into this parable of the pearl, this is about value. The pearl of great price. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had, and he bought it. He was obsessed, right? Because that pearl was greater than any other pearl in the world. But he didn't buy it to sell it again. You ever see that in the parable? He didn't buy it. It wasn't a business transaction. He didn't buy it because he thought, boy, if I had that pearl, I could make a lot of money off of it. He bought it to have it, to possess it. And when you really think about that, it's funny because I think of Lord of the Rings. I don't know if you've ever seen Lord of the Rings, but I always think about Precious, He just wanted that ring, didn't he? He didn't want anybody else to have it. Didn't matter what it was worth because he was obsessed with that ring, wasn't he? He wanted it, right? Had nothing to do with the value of the ring or what it was. He desired it. And that's what Jesus is saying about this pearl. This merchant didn't buy this pearl because he wanted to make a good business deal. He didn't buy it because he thought, well, I'll sell all I have and I'll sell this pearl and make a lot of money. He bought it because he admired pearls, didn't he? He admired pearls. And he found this pearl and he said, I have to own this pearl. I have to have this pearl because there's not another one like it. And if he got that pearl, he couldn't sell it because that would go against everything this parable says. He couldn't sell it. He's obsessed with it. And that's what Jesus says about the kingdom of heaven. He says you can't it's not a business transaction, it's not a deal. It's so precious that if you ever get it, you have to be obsessed with it. You have to have it. It has to be yours. And I think of all these little bitty snippet parables, this one always speaks the most to me because it really talks about obsession with something that you have to possess it. It needs to be yours because the kingdom of heaven, once we possess it, it really is ours. It's really mine. It belongs to me. And I know that there's enough of it to go around. Don't get me wrong, right? We can all have the perfect pearl. I'm not saying it's just mine, but it is mine. It belongs to me. I'm obsessed with it. I would never sell it or barter it off or use it as a chip because I'm obsessed with it. And I think that's what this pearl is. And then he talks about the parable of the net. And this really kind of goes back almost to the parable of the tares. But it's interesting here. He's inside the house. He's just with those apostles. And he says the kingdom of heaven's like a dragnet cast into the sea and gathering fish of every kind. And when it was filled, they drew it up and threw it on the beach. And they sat down and gathered the good and the bad they threw away. Now, it's interesting. It's something I think you have to think about. Is a lot of people say, well, the kingdom of heaven's not here, right? Kingdom of heaven, we're still waiting for it. But every one of these parables says the kingdom's here. Kingdom's here. The kingdom's now. Kingdom is in our midst, as Jesus would say. And he says that in this kingdom, because he says this kingdom, oftentimes we think the kingdom of heaven and we think, oh, well, that's just heaven. That's just the church. That's just the saved. That's the kingdom of heaven. But in these parables, Jesus calls the world the kingdom of heaven, doesn't he? Everybody, the good, the bad, we all exist in the kingdom. Now we're not be part of the kingdom, but we all exist in the kingdom of heaven because it's here. Isn't that what Jesus said? The kingdom of heaven's in your midst. And then these parables play that out because Jesus says, listen, it's all going to be gathered in. All these, the good and the bad, all this is the kingdom of heaven. He doesn't say, oh, well, the kingdom of heaven, we're just going to gather in the righteous. We're just going to gather the wheat. We're going to leave the tares in the field, and eventually we're going to destroy the tares. He doesn't say, oh, well, we're going to, we're only going to get good fish in the net. He says it's all going to be there. And he says this is the end of the age. They'll come forth, they'll take out the wicked from among the righteous. They will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus always compares hell, punishment to fire. Fire in the Bible is always punishment, trial, tribulation, tested by fire, proved with fire. Every time you see fire in the Bible, that's what we're talking about, and the idea of that pain. Throw them into the furnace, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So in this particular discourse, third discourse of Jesus in Matthew, it's these series of 7 parables. And Jesus, the first 4 are in the open. Everybody's there to hear him. The last 3 takes them into the house. He explains the parable of the tares. I think that's the break. He brings just those in to explain the parable of the tares. And then with those closest to him, he shares the last 3 parables, right? The pearl of great price, the parable of the net. He shares these last, the field, the treasure in the field. He shares that with just those closest to him. So I think if you read that, I want to invite you to read that on your own and kind of keep that in mind and think why he did that. What was the shift? What was the break? What was he trying to tell his apostles that he didn't want all them people outside to know? I think that's a question that I kind of think about when I read this. Why did he shift it? Why did Jesus shift it? And wouldn't it be interesting, I think, when he did that? Do you think the people outside wanted to come in? I was thinking about that, What did he say? Oh, I'm taking these guys in. You guys got to stay out here. I've always kind of wondered about, just how he did that. And how big was the house? Thought about that too. How many did he take in, right? Just those 12? But those are questions I have no answers to. But what's an interesting discourse. So we're going to keep kind of working through these. We got 2 more to go, these 5 great discourses in Matthew. So thanks for your time this evening. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand.